Our gospel reading this morning comes once again from the Gospel of Luke. Hear these words. The apostles said to the Lord, "Increase our faith." The Lord replied, "If you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you would say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it would obey you. Who among you would say to your slave who has just come in from plowing or tending sheep in the field, 'Come here at once and take your place at the table'? Would you not rather say to him, 'Prepare supper for me, put on your apron, and serve me while I eat and drink. Later you may eat and drink'? Do you thank the slave for doing what was commanded? So you also, when you have done all that you were ordered to do, say, 'We are worthless slaves. We have done only what we ought to have done.'" Please pray with me. Might words spoken and words heard and the spaces in between fill us with hope. Amen. Heidi Newmark is a Lutheran pastor who serves in New York City. For many years, she was the pastor of Transfiguration Church in the South Bronx, one of the most distressed, worn down, and dangerous parts of that great city. Heidi is also the author of 2 books, Breathing Space and Hidden Inheritance. She will be serving as our shared scholar lecturer this coming winter. In Breathing Space, Heidi describes in great detail some of the horrors and challenges that residents in her neighborhood faced every single day. Immense poverty, heavy drug trafficking, nonstop violence. In the 80s and early 90s, she writes, "It seemed that whenever I sat down to pray, I was interrupted by gunshots. Scarcely a night went inviolate. Bullets stealing lives, stealing childhoods, and stealing, too, the calm and bright of the night." One of the young people destroyed by gun violence was a light-skinned young man known by his street name, White Boy. After he was murdered in an argument over drugs, a mural in his memory was spray painted by his friends on the side of a building. He is depicted in that mural with a machine gun in one hand and with his other hand gesturing towards the spot where he was killed. Written above his picture, an epitaph of sorts, including the words, "Ventredores, les espero." "Come on, traitors, I'm waiting for you." That mural had been turned into something of a shrine, if you will. Candles, flowers, and even plates of food were constantly being left in front of it. On what would have been his 20th birthday, Heidi spotted a paper plate with a hot dog, potato chips, and a piece of yellow birthday cake, all laid out at the feet of his painting. In Heidi's Lutheran tradition, children are prepared for their first communion in special classes And so it was at Transfiguration Church. But in that violent context, Heidi felt it necessary to help her young students see something more in communion than the usual explanations of the symbolism of the sacred meal. So she took a picture of that mural of White Boy and she turned it into a poster. Then she took the poster with her to the First Communion class. First, she had the children draw pictures of their favorite meals. One child from the Dominican Republic drew a picture of her cousin's birthday party. It was her favorite meal, she said, because the whole family was together with no fighting. A little boy drew a drawing of a stack of pancakes, complete with warm, dripping butter and syrup and steam rising out of the top of it. His grandmother's pancakes, he said, were his favorite food, and they made him happy. He was living with his grandmother because his mother, her daughter, had died of AIDS. Once the children had finished sharing their drawings, Heidi showed them the picture of White Boy's mural with its food offerings and flowers. The children had all seen the mural many, many times. Some of them, no doubt, walked by it every day on their way to school. They knew his story. Everybody in the neighborhood knew his story. Together they discussed how he was betrayed, how he took up a gun and sought revenge. But Jesus, Heidi told them, was also betrayed. And he made a different choice. And on the night of his betrayal, he shared a meal with his friends, including the betrayer. We talked about the difference between these meals, these choices, and these uses of power, writes Pastor Newmark. For when we share communion, she explained, when we share it, we are remembering Jesus and his nonviolent way, and how even in his darkest time, when he had been betrayed, he did not give up hope. He did not become vengeful. Rather, he continued to trust in God. Now, some of you might be thinking to yourselves, well, such an approach, that's rather unadvisable, isn't it, for a class of school-age children, some of them as young as 6 or 7? Why expose them to such violent images and ideas as those portrayed in that mural? Yet the truth is they already were exposed. They already lived lives in the midst of that violence, that terror, that ongoing fear. They were already exposed to the violent realities that lay behind the mural. After all, remember, one little girl's favorite meal was her favorite because there was no fighting. And she doesn't mean just the give and take that can happen at any family meal. No doubt those children lived in what was at times a seemingly hopeless world. In sharing the story of the Last Supper, in pointing out the differences between the actions taken by White Boy and those taken by Jesus, Heidi was simply saying, children, there is another way. There is hope. Our reading from Lamentations comes from a place and time as seemingly hopeless as the South Bronx in the 1980s and 90s. Jerusalem, which Anna sang about so beautifully, Jerusalem had been decimated by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. The temple had been leveled, destroyed. The city walls were a ruin. Many of the city's leading citizens and others had been taken into exile in Babylon, some 800 miles away from their beloved homeland. No doubt for those left behind, it was a grim time filled with bitter weeping. Speaking of the city, the writer fairly moans, "All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. They have betrayed her." He and his fellow residents are in such despair that they don't even have the energy to say, "Ventradores, les espero." Come on, traitors. Instead, they are shattered people, living shattered lives. Yet, in the midst of their despair, they are still able to cling to the symbols and stories of their faith and find hope. It is good, they say, that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good that one should not seek revenge. That sense of despair, of hopelessness, is a feeling experienced all too often by all too many people. You may be feeling that way yourself. That may be what brought you here this morning. Perhaps a loved one has died, or there's a divorce in the family, or a lost job, or an ill child. Maybe it's just the general state of the world that has you feeling despair, the lack of common civility, the violence, the threats to the environment, the never-ending wars. Fortunately, though, as Pastor Newmark shared with her students, fortunately, there are sacramental moments in life when through some very earthly symbols, we can see heavenly hope. Around the same time that Pastor Newmark was serving the Transfiguration Church in the South Bronx, journalist Terry Anderson was being released after having been held hostage for 7 years in Lebanon. He had been kidnapped in March of 1985 while serving as chief Middle East correspondent for the Associated Press. His captors shunted him about from place to place, holding him in close to 20 different locations over that 7-year period of time. Often he was in chains and locked in tiny rooms where the sun could never be seen, sometimes because he was blindfolded, other times because there simply were no windows. Much of the time he was held in solitary confinement, a darkness in and of itself. But in time he was joined by other hostages, including Presbyterian pastor Benjamin Weir and Roman Catholic priest Lawrence Jenko. Together they formed what they came to call the Church of the Locked Door. In addition to entertaining themselves by making decks of playing cards out of scraps of paper and a tiny chess set out of little pieces of foil. They also knotted rosaries from carpet strings. And despite their being fed far less than they needed to truly thrive, they saved bits of stale bread so that they could celebrate communion. That ancient meal, that ancient reminder of hope, buoyed them up. It helped them make it through incredibly dark days and long nights. And despite feeling at times like they had been abandoned, perhaps even betrayed, they held steady in their faith. Anderson wrote 32 poems while he was in captivity, all of them in his head. He had to beg for the occasional piece of paper to write a letter to his loved ones, and a few of the poems made their way into those very rare letters, but most of them were held in the recesses of his mind only to surface after his release. One of his poems describes one of those communion services in chains. I share it with you sacramentally, even as we will shortly share the cup and loaf. 5 men huddled close against the night and our oppressors, around a bit of stale bread hoarded from a scanty meal, and a candle lit not only as a symbol, but to read the text by. The priests, as poorly clad, as drawn with strain as any, but his voice is calm, his face serene. This is the core of his existence, the reason he was born. Behind him, I can see his predecessors in their generations, back to the catacombs, heads nodding in approval, hands with his tracing out the stately ritual, adding the power of their suffering and faith to his and ours. The ancient words shake off their dust and come alive. The voices of their authors echo from the damp, bare walls. The familiar prayers come straight out of our hearts. Once again, Christ's promise is fulfilled. His presence fills us. The miracle is real. The miracle is real. In those bits of stale bread, in their fellowship together, they found hope. Indeed, in the sacramental loaf and cup of the communion meal, men and women, girls and boys around the world and across the ages have taken hope. No matter how grim, no matter how dark, they have found the courage to go on. They have found the will to continue taking one step at a time, even when those steps were enchained. They have found the courage to seek after God's will, seeking to forego revenge and instead find forgiveness and strength and hope. On a night of betrayal and desertion, Jesus took bread and gave us hope.